You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today, we're looking at some players who you might consider dropping in fantasy basketball leagues. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. These aren't players that you just automatically go and hit the drop button on if they're on your roster. They're ones you consider if that opportunity arises, depending on where you are in the playoffs, in a head-to-head matchup, how easy the playoff matchup is. These are just names that we should be considering that aren't considered must-roster players in 12-team standard head-to-head leagues. So let's have a look at this list of guys I want to talk about. And the first guy I want to talk about here is Harry Giles of the Sacramento Kings. Rashawn Holmes is back. He is going to be taking these minutes off Giles pretty quickly. Alex Len outplayed Giles in yesterday's game as well. It was a nice little story for Giles to be that starting center and to put up sort of back-end 12-team league value over that period of time. But now I think that dream is done, and I'd be more than... Look, and maybe he does put up a good game in the next one. That's entirely possible from Giles, but the opportunity cost of holding on to him versus streaming in that spot, grabbing that next hot player, grabbing a guy that's streaking, maybe it is someone like a Big Shaq Harrison.
Big Shaq.
You're having that opportunity to open up that roster spot versus holding a Giles who's going to drop off and has already started to drop off is the move that I'll be making. We're talking head-to-head playoffs. We're talking the end of a roto season. You've got to make those moves. You've got to churn through them. You've got to get your games up. You've got to just cut bait on guys who are trending down, and Giles is one of those players. Of course, the next guy is his teammate, the pencil, Harrison Barnes. Barnesy. Still rostered in too many leagues. I still don't understand why he is rostered in 91% of advanced leagues. He is, over the course of the season, the 157th ranked player, and your standard 12-team league rosters 156 players. So not even in that sort of discussion, he could have the occasional good game, but they're just way too few and far between for me to consider Barnesy a guy that we want to hold on to, as you're all well aware. The next one, I think, is one that needs to be mentioned. That is Jarrett Allen of the Brooklyn Nets. Allen has been displaced as the starter by interim puppet master actual puppet Jacque Vaughn in Brooklyn by DeAndre Jordan as the starting center. He was already a 10-team drop anyway, as they were sort of splitting minutes with Jordan, but now if he's going to play 19, 20 a night, you cannot hold on to him in 12-team leagues either. Maybe they change things over, but given the reason that Kenny Atkinson was fired is because he did not start a significantly worse player in DeAndre Jordan. Jordan will not be going back to the bench now, so Allen is a drop. He is an absolute massive buy low in Dynasty leagues as well. I think he's traded in the offseason. He goes to another team, he plays 28 minutes a night, and he cracks the top 70. But that's in Dynasty leagues. For this year, he is a drop. Dillon Brooks of the Memphis Grizzlies. They are getting Justice Winslow back pretty soon, it looks like. They're getting Jaren Jackson back pretty soon. They also have to deal with the fact that they're also still got Dillon Brooks, because he is really bad, and he is not providing the value that would necessitate a hold in a 12-team league. He is, over the course of this season, the 161st ranked player. That's not very good, and it's been worse recently. Over the last 2 weeks, he's the 250th ranked player. He's still rostered in 75% of advanced leagues. If you're holding on for him, waiting for that turnaround, just don't drop him. You stream in an Eric Pascal. You stream in Naz Reid, or you just hold Naz Reid. You stream in DJ Augustin. You stream in Gary Harris. You don't bother holding on to someone who really isn't that good, and I don't believe is a long-term starter on a good NBA team. That's for those of you in Dynasty leagues that have him. I think he's significantly overrated. Many people, and there was a lot of discussion about him when you talk about the Grizzlies core of Jackson and Morant, and you throw in Brandon Clark, and a lot of people would arc up, especially at me and others as well. Hey, you got to include Dillon Brooks in that young core. I don't have to include him in there, and I won't include him in there. I just don't think he's that good, but that's beside the point. In terms of talking about his value for this season, drop him. Carmelo Anthony, I think this one's a pretty clear one as well. Melo started off a bit really surprising when he signed with Portland, but it has been downhill ever since then. 133rd over the course of the season. He shoots okay, and with Zach Collins returning soon, most likely, with Yusuf Nurkic also returning soon. They don't necessarily play the same position. Well, Zach Collins does. That's going to have a big impact on Melo. And while Collins might only play 24 minutes a night, that means there's going to be 2 to 3 fewer minutes of Melo. And even in 32-33, he's not getting it done as a must-roster player. So I think Melo is a pretty clear drop to me in 12-team leagues. This one's a little bit more controversial. Lou Williams of the LA Clippers. It hasn't really been great for Lou of late. With Paul George and Kawhi Leonard healthy, fit, firing, there just isn't the amount of touches or the amount of minutes for Lou Williams. Instead of playing 29 a night and having 30% usage, we're seeing him play 25 a night or 26 a night or 24 a night, and the touches go way down. And if he's not touching the ball a ton, if he's not getting those minutes and scoring big, he's not a top 100 player. And if he's not a top 100 player, then he's a guy that we look at as someone who is expendable. Absolutely in 10-team leagues and in 12-teamers. He's got a very specific skill set. He can influence free throw percentage, which not many people can do. So maybe you need that. And that's definitely a reason to hold on to him. But if you don't need that, if that's not important for you in your matchup, then he's gone. He can still influence that category. That's fine. But overall, I think he's rostered in far too many leagues. 98% rostered is Lou Williams. And I don't think that number should hold with this team as healthy as they are. Al Horford's putting up really good numbers at the moment. But Joel Embiid is expected to return this week. And when Joel Embiid returns this week, Al Horford is going to drop way off. Now, this is a preemptive type of drop scenario for Horford. And I wouldn't drop him until I actually hear that Embiid is coming back. But if you're in a desperate situation where you need to clear open a roster spot, then Horford is a guy that we can consider as a drop player, because we've seen multiple situations where he's been coming off the bench behind Embiid or even playing next to Embiid, and it hasn't worked out. And when Embiid's out and Horford plays, the numbers are pretty good. Well, that situation's going to change in the next couple of games, maybe even next game, and Horford's going to lose that value. Plus, the Sixers played 2 games this week. They play on Wednesday, they play on Saturday. So, can you get more value by dropping him and streaming in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday? Like you're streaming those days instead of his 2 games, which might both be subpar performances? Yeah, I reckon you can, especially if you are already in a playoff matchup, which, as I mentioned on yesterday's show, your playoffs should be starting actually right now. The next one we talk about is an injured player, and that is Malcolm Brogdon. He is week to week. I don't know whether that means 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I know it means more than 1 week. And to throw that all in there, Brogdon hasn't been playing well. So for a guy that we don't know when he's going to come back, who isn't playing well, there is absolutely no reason for me to be holding on to Brogdon. He's outside the top 100 over the last 2 weeks. Victor Oladipo is back. He's dealing with another injury, his 7th injury for this season, Brogdon, with his hip, which is going to impact him when he comes back as well. He has been, over the last 3 months, the 129th ranked player. That's just not worth holding on to. Despite how well he was playing at the beginning of the season, it's not worth holding on to for a bloke that might be out for 3 or 4 weeks. I'll find better value than this guy who maybe is the 100th best player on his return. Absolutely no need, in my opinion, to hold on to Brogdon in those situations. And the last one's a similar one. Evan Fournier of the Orlando Magic has been strong this year. Absolutely. He's been the 63rd best player, really shooting the ball well, but he's out for maybe another 2 weeks with an elbow injury, and you're in the head-to-head playoffs. You can't deal with that. You can't deal with a guy who's not in your best 2 or 3 players to be out for 2 weeks. And even if these are his best 2 to 3 players, like Karl Anthony Towns, like Ben Simmons, you might need to make hard decisions and drop those guys, because it's all well and good that they might be back for your final matchup. But if having zeros for the next 2 weeks with Towns and Simmons means that you don't get to your final matchup, it doesn't make any difference. Now, of course, every league should have 1 IR slot at an absolute minimum. And probably in my leagues next year, I'm going to institute 2 injured reserve slots. So you don't have to drop these players, because then what that does, and the reason, it's part of the game, yeah, that's bullshit. Because I tell you what it does is, having to drop these very, very good players, these top round, this is irrespective of Fournier, but when you have to drop a Towns or a Simmons or a Steph Curry earlier in the season, when you have to drop those players, what it does is it makes the good teams stronger, because they're sitting there with a really strong team and they can just go, well, I can absorb losses for the next 5 weeks. I'll take them and I'll just stash them and it doesn't matter. Therefore, when it comes to the playoffs, the good teams get better. It's not an even playing field. It just makes it, again, it's richening the rich, which I don't think richening's a word, but you know what I mean. That's why you should have those IR spots. Probably multiple IR spots is what I'll be looking at in my leagues next season. One other name I want to quickly mention, Tomas Satoransky, benched for Monday's game with Kobe White starting. I have mentioned this quite a few times on Basketball Monster and over on this podcast, talking about how I think he's going to be benched pretty soon, and the minutes are already down. He is a pretty clear drop candidate for me as well. In a lot of cases, not every case, he still can provide some assists, and he still probably gets you 25 or so minutes, but there's a big difference between 25 minutes for Satoransky and 30 minutes, because I can do maths, so that is that big difference, and I think in that case, streaming him through is probably going to work out better for you in most cases. Getting someone else into that roster spot. He has been solid enough this year, the 103rd ranked player, but over the last 2 weeks, he's 193rd, and I think 150 to 170 is probably going to be more realistic for Satoransky while he comes off the bench. The Bulls have 4 games this week, so that can be a little bit tough to stomach, and maybe that pushes him to be a hold for you this week, but he's at least a name that you have to consider. Guys, that'll do it for me today. I'll be back later on to recap all of Monday's action and preview a very big Tuesday in the NBA. Subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and on YouTube. And after you finish listening to this podcast, why don't you check out today's episode of Locked On NBA as well. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.